Why do humans, by the way, still physically fight when we have all this technology? Why not just let, it seems like they're just going to bomb each other anyway. Why not just let all the missiles do the talking?
I think increasingly we're probably moving to a time uh, when technology really is taking over. Technology allows militaries to be much more exact in how they carry out the war. As you know, things like smart bombs can be extraordinarily accurate. The other big part of this is the use of drones. So drones don't require you to use soldiers in the field. And in fact, drones are increasingly inexpensive and can be produced in huge numbers. I think that's something we're seeing in Ukraine right now and Russia. They're just producing massive numbers of drones that can be used. Ultimately, we'll see at the end if this conflict ever ends. Presumably, it will at some point. But we'll see whether you can win a war on the basis of drones alone and technology. But I think you're right. I think that we're moving to a time when we're relying more on technology and less on human beings. I mean, of course, you have to have the technology, and the technology can be expensive.
Now, like when you see these parades that go on, like yearly parades with like some country, and then you see these like shows, military shows. It's like a private show, and you see these like soldiers marching, like a physical, actual physical army, and they show off their tanks and their soldiers. It's like a dance contest or something. It's not even like, what are they doing? Where are they going to fight a war with the uniform?
There's a famous definition of the state, that a state is the entity that has a monopoly on the use of force. And so sometimes uh, all that show, it can be for the benefit of other countries, and it can be for the benefit of your own people to show that there is a powerful state, and that if you attack us or you challenge the state, this is what you're going to have to confront.
But who was scared about that, Ian? Like, who's worried about
Oh,
the tank? Really? It
I
works?
I think it does work.
But I mean, like let's say the whatever, like one of the countries, like North Korea or something. They're one that they put on these parades and stuff.
Of course, North Korea is also, whenever they have those parades, they're wanting to make it clear that they have a formidable army. It's also not the case that countries that are seemingly big and powerful win wars. The United
Small
States,
countries can too.
small countries can too, or they can make life unpleasant enough. The United States pulled out of Afghanistan. So did the Soviet Union. The United States had a lot of trouble in Vietnam. Even if these countries don't prevail in the sort of conventional sense, the smaller country can make life very unpleasant.
How?
You can engage in guerrilla warfare. I mean, when I think about a lot of the time, also big military hardware is not very effective for guerrillas that can just um, shoot a few soldiers and then melt into the local communities. A country that I've spent quite a bit of time in is Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian government was essentially a client of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They received massive amounts of military hardware, uh, and they were ultimately defeated by a bunch of rebels that really did not have any hardware of their own, but that would just um, uh, incrementally accumulate it uh, um, in their battles with the central government. And eventually, the Soviet Union stopped providing military hardware to the Ethiopian government, and literally within a matter of months or a couple of years, the Ethiopian government collapsed.
Why don't politicians and leaders fight in the war alongside soldiers?
Sometimes they do, um, but of course, the a leader is the one that ultimately has to be in a position to make decisions, and so,
But Ian, are they really that special though?
oh, I think so. Uh,
Leaders really? But they have like a whole cabal of people behind them, right? Like if he goes, just get the next guy to do it. Like they made the decision, go fight in the war.
well, maybe. I'm not sure. It's a lot of the time, or on occasion, leaders have been replaced because they haven't executed the war successfully. Uh, I think leadership does make a difference. Um, but it's probably also true that leaders that are seen as being in the field, soldiers are willing to fight when they see their leaders in the field with them.
Do you think countries and people cannot be as ruthless as they could have been in the past?
That's probably true. That's always been a tricky issue, starting with I'd say the first Gulf War, when the Americans and its coalition partners sought to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait. There was always this question of having embedded journalists, and so on. Sometimes journalists report on the atrocities of, or not just the atrocities, but of things that don't make that don't look very good on evening newscasts. Of course, Canada also got into trouble themselves when there were atrocities committed against a Somali teenager. So, yeah, I think that militaries, especially in the West, have to be much more careful. Uh, that's probably a good thing. An image, especially an atrocity, can be a powerful thing. A few years ago, in the midst of the darkest days, I should say, of the Syrian civil war, there were images that the Syrian government would make public that were again showing really unthinkable atrocities. And the idea was to intimidate people, in a sense, to say, you know, don't take on the the Syrian government, because this is what will happen to you. Um, so there can be a lot of signaling that goes on using brutal images.
For example, about ruthlessness, for example, in let's say like World War II, right? America was able to nuke Japan really badly. And this whole strategy of just destroying your enemy and just bringing them down to their knees and having them concede, accept defeat, it seems like this is not possible anymore. Like, have we learned that lesson from World War II? Like, if you compare that to the whole, like the Gulf War that you were talking about, these wars go on for so long that people forget that there's even a war going on because they can't really do that anymore. You can't destroy your enemy or have them just completely crippled and say, that's it, I surrender.
I think it depends on the conflict. Um, I think that, for instance, these days there's enough dislike for someone like Vladimir Putin in Russia. I think the Americans would be just fine with having an outright defeat of Russian forces. Um, I don't think the Americans, thankfully, are willing to go nuclear, and I think they hope that Vladimir Putin doesn't go nuclear. But I suspect you're right nobody wants to go down the nuclear path again, and for good reason, because nuclear weapons are awful. Having said that, it's notable that nuclear weapons have also become now come with much, much, much smaller yields. There was a time when
Yield meaning like benefits?
yield meaning explosive power.
Oh, right.
So there was a time when the Russians had a 25 megaton warhead. Uh, I mean, it was often said that they had larger yields, explosive yields, because their missiles weren't as accurate as the American ones. But in any event, now yields are way, way smaller because they're much more accurate. And there's always this concern that, could you actually fight a war? Would you ever use very small yield nuclear weapons to win a war? So far, thankfully, again, nobody's been prepared to go ahead or to turn the war in Ukraine into a nuclear war. But it's a concern for the future, I would say.
Do governments go to war or do people?
Sometimes people go to war with their own governments, because usually I would say a government tends to represent a certain percentage of the population, and people don't want to be ruled by somebody else.
Do the people have to be behind it though? Like, do governments ever go to war without the consent of people or the public, the majority?
It's certainly easier to go to war if you build a consensus that says war is in the interests of the state. I suspect that that's probably one of the tasks of government, is to create the sense that you're under threat, and therefore, action needs to be taken. I should say the war the Americans launched against Iraq was that there had to be a consensus that it was in the interests of the American public to go to war. I don't think that same consensus existed in Canada, and that's why I think our Prime Minister at the time, didn't engage in it. But in the United States, I think there was a remarkably broad consensus. Now, of course, people like to say, oh, they weren't in favor, but there's not many that can say. I mean, Barack Obama, perhaps, but most politicians, Democrat and Republican, were in favor of going to war against Iraq, against the Saddam Hussein regime.
Why don't countries or places just make it mandatory to vote or something? Like we're thinking about doing this, let's just get a vote and see what people think.
You mean a vote?
Whether to get involved in
to
something or go invade or whatever, anything, any kind of conflict.
Well, that's I suppose, a fair question. I mean, perhaps the answer is because a vote might take some time, and I'm not sure that governments actually want to go to war. A lot of the time, they don't see war as something that they have chosen ahead of time. It's because they say that they're under threat.
But in honesty, who cares about the time? Like, what does it matter? Like, why do they have to, even if it takes time, like you said, they're unspeakable atrocities and stuff. Maybe it's worth taking the time. Is there an urgency to war?
There can be, I think. In the case of Israel, there was a belief that the response had to be immediate, or at least that was the calculation of the Netanyahu government, is that that Hamas's attack on October 7th was of a kind that it required a near instantaneous response, so that to limit further attacks. And in fact, I don't even know if a vote is necessary in Israel. Certainly, my understanding is that the Israeli government continues to have the support of the Israeli people. And that's interesting. That's notable because immediately prior to the October 7th attacks, the Israeli government was subject to considerable criticism. And in fact, it probably won't, again, if the pollsters are correct, if and when this war ends, the Israeli government probably wouldn't survive another election.
Why does that happen all the time? It seems like that's like an inevitable fate of most wars, is that whoever leads, as soon as the war is over, the public cannot wait to get them out. One of the well-known examples is Churchill, who was like hailed as a hero in World War II, depending on what country, what people you're talking about. And the minute the soldiers came back, they're like, yeah, enough, out with you.
Well, yes, but then he came back to power again later on. You want a leader that will protect you, or that you believe will protect you.
So
There's
is there a certain temperament then for a leader to have during wartime?
I think so. I think it's a conviction that it's not just about peace, it's about security. It's a conviction that your leader will provide you with security. There's some scholarship that has looked at the way that voters have been quite forgiving of politicians who often commit, um, uh, who either break the law or have engaged in violence themselves. Because they think that they are most secure under their leadership. Even something like the use of the nuclear weapons at the end of against Japan at the end of World War II. Uh, there's obviously much more scrutiny about that today than I think that there was then. Um, so I think leaders are often given a pass, and especially if they win. Um,
Do you think there are certain qualities that people like to see in leaders that are leading them during wartime? And do those qualities differ from when it's just peacetime or regular time?
yes, I do think so. I mean,
What do you think the qualities are? Like they want someone who's strong and ruthless during wartime?
I think they want a leadership that is uh, willing to be ruthless if called upon. People want to be secure, and so they will, I think, take on a leadership that provides them with that security. I mean, in a couple of decades ago in Liberia, there was a warlord named Charles Taylor. Nobody disputed his ruthlessness. And in fact, and he really was ruthless, but he won an election. And I don't think it's because people liked him, but they were actually would rather have him in power. It was said, rather than out of power and wanting to get back in.